is generally not a good idea. You want to capture towards the center in most cases. So, okay, moving on here. 18, control the center before attacking. A very good point. Successful attacks on the wings depend mostly on center control. Therefore, concern yourself with a strong and stable center before starting any lateral attack. And that goes back to what we just discussed a moment ago about controlling the center and about how vital that is. Very important to control these four center squares. And of course, we do not want to attack too early. Um, very important. Go ahead and develop and um, get your position set before you think about attacking. There are situations, of course, where your opponent will make mistakes and you can take advantage of those. Um, okay, 19. Pawns are the foundation of strategy. The pawn structure is fundamental to any position because it improves or reduces the effectiveness of pieces. Very true. In order to achieve good pawn conformation, all different kinds of weak pawns should be avoided. Isolated, doubled, backward, and hanging pawns. And we will definitely get more into that again as we get into the um, studying more specifically with pawn structures. An isolated pawn here, a backwards pawn here, um, uh, doubled pawns here, and these are all weaknesses. Of course, that's weak. This is weak. And also we have now pawn islands are very important to understand as well. So we could look at this. We could call this one pawn island, two pawn island, second pawn island, and third pawn island. And the fewer pawn islands you have, the stronger your position. So if this pawn was here and not doubled, then we would have one pawn island. Okay? All right. Much stronger, less pawn islands. Pawn weakness is eternal. While pieces can move to become more active, this is extremely important to understand. While pieces can move to become more active, any deficiency in pawn structure is a long-term weakness. Double pawns, isolated pawn, severe weaknesses here, and black is in huge trouble already. Therefore, if your opponent has weak pawns, you don't need to hurry to explore them. That's a very good point as well, something to keep in mind. 21, avoid doubled pawns. Here we have, and we have three pawn islands in this position. And this is a tremendous weakness in the end game. And in fact, with black to move, white cannot defend this pawn. Uh, with black to move, rook h3, attacking this pawn. The rook cannot come to defend. The king cannot reach it to defend. The only thing that it can do is move forward, and then of course rook f3, and then the pawn falls. Double pawns are two pawns of the same color lined up on the same file. They have less mobility than normal ones and normal pawns and are more vulnerable to attacks, especially when isolated. However, they do not always represent a disadvantage. I would not agree with that. The general rule is they do represent a disadvantage. Dominance of an open or half-open adjacent file or even additional control of the center may often be a sufficient compensation, though it is I would call that very, very rare. Okay, we're going to look at a few more here and wrap up this this brief video. 22. Avoid isolated pawns. Bing, bing. Isolated pawns are those with no friendly pawn on either adjacent file, therefore they cannot be defended by a pawn of the same color. When they are under attack and have to be protected when they are under attack and have to be protected by a piece, which we just looked at a moment ago. The main weakness of an isolated pawn is that the square directly in front of it is debilitated, a hole, because it cannot be controlled by another pawn and is easily occupied by an enemy piece. Isolated pawns are even more vulnerable when placed in half-open files. Here we have a half-open file, as black has no pawn on the C file. Isolated pawns, again, are even more vulnerable when placed in half-open files because they become easy targets for enemy rooks. And yeah, tremendous weakness. Okay. Avoid backward pawns. Here we have this backward pawn, this backward pawn, and each of these is a tremendous weakness. And and again, we will go in depth into understanding why these are such weaknesses as we move on. A backward pawn is closer to its base, considering its adjacent comrades, and is prevented from advancing because the square directly in front of it is under an enemy pawn's control. Not necessarily true, but okay. A backward pawn usually impairs communication between defensive pieces, and the weak square hole in front of it may easily be occupied by an enemy piece. Now that is very important to understand. Communication between uh, not just defensive pieces, but all of your pieces. Communication is basically these two rooks right here are in communication because they can see each other. Okay, very important for your rooks to be in communication. 24, avoid creating holes, weak squares. Yeah, very weak. Every time you advance a pawn, the square beside him become holes. A hole is a square that cannot be protected by pawns. Its main disadvantage is that it is easily occupied by enemy pieces, improving their effectiveness because they are not easily chased away from their positions. For example, knight f4. That's a very good point. Since they are free from opponent pawn attacks. So that is very, very important to keep in mind. With g4 here, we are creating a hole at f4. And then, I mean, the white knight could play knight e2, d4, and then look to attack the knight, which is pretty easily defended. Okay, let's look at one more here. Oh, actually, that's covered here. Okay, avoid pawn islands. Well, again, too many pawn islands is maybe a better way to look at that. 25, avoid pawn islands. A pawn group separated from the others by one or more files is called an island. One island, two island, three island, four island. Each island contains a basic position that has to be protected by other pieces. Therefore, the more islands a player possesses, the harder it gets to defend them. It is useful to consider influences on the pawn structure every time you trade pieces. Extremely useful, I would say. At the end game, the smallest number of islands may be considered a significant advantage, without question. At the end game, the smallest number of islands are certainly considered a significant advantage. Okay, hope you learned something from this. We will put together another lesson for tomorrow, and we're going to continue to go through these. And then we are currently creating a number of training videos to share with you guys. We hope you enjoyed today's lesson here at SantaRosaChessClub.com, and we will see you soon and wish you success in your chess.